Good morning and welcome to this live webinar all about True Cloud and your business. I'm Maggie Holland. I'm Editorial Director of the B2B sites at Dennis Publishing, Cloud Pro, Channel Pro and IT Pro, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion this morning, which is brought to us in association with our sponsor Workday. I'm joined by two fantastic panellists. We have Dave Sahigan, CTO of EMEA for Workday. Thanks very much for joining me. And we have Renee Millman, who's a freelance writer, editor and broadcaster. Thanks for joining me. For what really promises to be a fantastic discussion, we are going to cover topics such as what is True Cloud? It's a big question, but one that we hope to answer during this discussion. Also talking about the value of moving or migrating your financial data to the cloud, perhaps why financial data or the finance departments and accountancy departments have lagged behind HR in moving to the cloud traditionally. There must be reasons behind that, so I hope that we can discuss those today as well. All of that and more, really. So you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to my fantastic panellists. I do encourage you to submit questions at any point during the discussion using the console, and we hope to answer them as best we can. This webinar will also be available on demand after the event, but please use the opportunity we have with these experts to submit your questions during the session. So without further ado, Dave, I'm going to hand back to you to give a brief introduction to who you are and what you do.
Excellent, yeah. I'm Dave Sahigan. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for EMEA for Workday. I've been with the company for a little over 8 years now and based here in the UK, as you can tell from my accent, for the last year or so. Workday started in 2006 in the US, but started really as a global focused company for core HR and finance and in the US and UK payroll systems, and has really been focused on that mission ever since. And we started in the cloud, so I feel like perhaps I'm a bit biased, but I have a picture of what True Cloud is about, and a lot of that is the level of commitment to making sure that the cloud applications function really well, they perform really well, they're incredibly secure. That we have no choice at Workday. We have to do that. We don't have a fallback position of we can send a customer a disk to go ahead and install it. And so that's really been our focus right from the start in terms of how we develop the software, is keeping a focus on the cloud. And really for us, the vision came from consumer internet companies. Even back in 2006, companies like Amazon and Google and Netflix and others already existed and were serving millions or now billions of customers globally through the cloud, and doing it in a secure fashion as well. So we took our inspiration from them in terms of things like UI, servers, how we set up the cloud, how we get performance out of the applications, and how we get great security. And that's really been a big part of our inspiration. I often say it's not whether we're 10 years ahead of other folks that build the same stuff, it's that we're 5 years behind those consumer internet companies, which is fine. We're fine to be cutting edge instead of bleeding edge, and we really do look to them in terms of how we're going to develop the software, and you'll hear that in some of the things we'll talk about as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction. And once again, thank you for joining me today. Really much appreciated. So Renee, obviously I know who you are,
yes,
but if you could tell the viewers, kind of a brief overview of, your background and why you're here today.
Okay, well, my name's Renee Millman. I'm a writer and broadcaster. I've been working in and writing about technology for about over 25 years now. I've also been an analyst at Gartner and IDC, and I've covered cloud computing for over a decade now, pretty much since its beginnings. I mean, I remember writing about application service provision, back at the turn of the millennium, and so that's obviously in the meantime transformed into SaaS, and now we're seeing that how SaaS is really coming to the fore and becoming a real enabler of business transformation.
I think we've got a lot to discuss, so I'm really excited. And once again, thank you for joining me today, Renee. So again, not here to listen to me, we're here to listen to you guys. And obviously, I'm going to be facilitating the discussion, obviously fielding questions from the audience. But I think the topic of cloud has moved on somewhat from several years ago, where people were very much questioning what is cloud computing and the various models, SaaS, PaaS, infrastructure as a service. And it now seems to have moved on from that curiosity to what it can actually do for me as a business, whether that's a business person in a department, a finance department, HR department, or for me, as a stakeholder within that business. So we're hearing true clouds. That's the topic of this webinar. So, you know, why is this now coming to the fore? Why are people now talking about true cloud versus just cloud generally, Dave?
Yeah, I think part of that comes from the genesis of it. Cloud, I mean, the term, as Renee was pointing out as well, it's sort of shifted around. Is it cloud? Is it software as a service? And for us, the key component is that it's not just hosting. It's not just taking applications that you would traditionally run on-premise and sticking them onto another server somewhere. There's certainly some benefits to that for many organizations. They can get some value out of not housing those servers inside of their four walls. But for us, the cloud and the true cloud is about saying this is born as a service that is going to be deployed using somebody else's not only servers, but also their knowledge of how to run and operate those systems, and that they're built natively for that purpose. So I think that's a big part of it, certainly for Workday, and we see also in other organizations that do similar things, that are other software as a service providers that really started in that place. That really is the focus of providing a service rather than a server or a hosting facility. So that tends to be what we talk about when we talk about true cloud. It's not a topic we talk about as much because so many CIOs are so much more comfortable with this concept of, I don't want to be responsible for 100% of managing every aspect of how this application functions. I want to have some of that responsibility be on the providers that I'm working with as well.
And what are the kind of key challenges, benefits and issues that you're seeing, you know, when you're out and about talking to customers, talking to partners, you know, around the topic of true cloud or the subtopics therein? What are the kind of key trends and concerns?
Well, I think one of the things I run into often is that a lot of folks are looking at the cloud now because it's the new thing to do, rather than saying, well, what's really the benefit that I'm going to get out of this? And when they step back and ask that, if it is really just taking your on-premise systems and putting them into the cloud, even if it is true cloud, what's the benefit there? Is it a lower cost? Okay, then you might be able to justify it. And I think for many organizations, and it's something I see, it's a big difference I see here in Europe versus in the United States. So you have these roles of chief digital officer or chief transformation officer, something that I've almost never seen in the United States. And it's those organizations that are starting to recognize from a board and CEO level, we need to digitally transform our business to be competitive. Once you start asking those transformation questions, that's when you start seeing the real benefits of the cloud, because it's about transforming your business and making sure that the applications that you're using aren't creating a barrier to doing that. So less about, hey, let's use technology to jump forward to the next thing. It's let's remove the barrier that our current technology is creating so that we can change our business and transform our business in the way that we want to. And certainly that's what we look for in the type of customers that are going to be really successful with Workday, rather than the ones that are just saying, heard about the cloud, I want to lower my costs. Can we move over to a cloud solution to do that?
So what are the key benefits? I mean, obviously I have my own opinion on this, but you know, why is one version of the truth when it comes to software so important? And you know, surely there must be some drawbacks, or is it all good?
Well, I think there's always trade-offs with systems. You know, the ability with an on-premise system to be able to configure and customize to anything that you want, and then maybe get stuck with the version that you have, that's can be seen as a benefit and may be critical in specific line of business software where it's core to what you do. If you're shoe manufacturing, your manufacturing systems to determine the size of your shoes, that's somewhere where you'd say that customization is absolutely critical. But in finance and HR, it's harder to make that argument. All businesses need to do this. Many of them need to be global, and they need to comply with the requirements globally. So that's an example of the sort of trade-off. I'm very blunt with CIOs and CTOs and CEOs that there's always a trade-off in terms of whenever you move to a new technology. It's not all good. We all know when we move from a landline to a smartphone, it drops calls. Yeah. That's a downside. A landline doesn't give you access to all human knowledge in your pocket. So that's an upside of the smartphone. And so I think there always are trade-offs, and that's why you need to look at, as an organization, are those benefits great enough? And mostly those have to do with about changing your business. You need to move forward. And the data question is really critical as we start looking at machine learning and bots and platform as a service, in-memory analytics, and all these topics that are becoming really a little overheated, perhaps. All that depends on really good data. And more organizations, no matter what business they're in, are recognizing they're not just people-driven organizations, they're data-driven organizations. And having that data in one place, or as consolidated as possible, secured in a consistent fashion, and available to the people that need it, makes a huge difference in terms of layering on those technologies at a later time.
So you talked about data there, Dave, and obviously, HR departments, if they're looking at themselves as a business within a business,
Yeah.
have, are very aware of the data they hold on employees and are very used to data driving what they do and the decisions they make.
Yes.
It should be the same in the financial space. Obviously, that's very data driven, but finance departments, financial industry generally has been a little slow to adopt technology generally, and it seems to be that pattern is following with the cloud. So why is this kind of gap between HR data moving to the cloud and enjoying the benefits versus financial?
I think all this stuff happens in waves. I think most in financial services and in finance departments, often they're seen as leaders in the technology side, but they wait until a certain time, until a lot of the risk has been removed. So naturally, finance and accounting departments tend to be fairly risk averse, so that's certainly a piece of it. But also they want to be able to measure what's the cost benefit analysis here. And again, if you're just looking to say, I want to move from on-premise to the cloud or to another cloud solution, it's hard to be able to pencil that out and say this is going to be a big benefit financially to the organization. I think the other factor, and that's perhaps a little more touchy, is that often HR doesn't really have a whole lot of choice about being customer focused, and that customer is the employee. Finance, and particularly accounting, historically hasn't necessarily been in that position. Their customer is the board, the CEO, and a few top executives at the organization for statutory reporting and compliance, and being able to say, look in the rearview mirror reports where you say, here's how the business is functioning. And we really do see that changing, what we call the democratization of data that is starting to happen as lines of business leaders, as departmental heads are saying, I know how I'm managing my people if I've got a good HR system, but I'm not sure how money is working in my part of the organization. And if I've got P&L responsibility, I want to be able to see that not just once a quarter, a month lagging information. I want to be able to see it in real time, and I should know that. And a lot of finance and accounting organizations are not set up to do that. Historically, they just haven't. So they don't have a motivation or an understanding of how to do that. So I think that's the other piece of how it lags. I do think there's a huge snowball effect where once that realization starts to happen, it will really move downhill really quickly from there.
And do you think financial stakeholders will perhaps be looking at their peers in HR and maybe other departments and how they're using, data to drive decisions in real time rather than that kind of rear view mirror, and kind of saying, hey, I want a piece of that. They're getting some benefits and efficiencies. What can we do here? So it's been driven internally as well as that kind of push from external factors.
I think it varies. I think the external factors, what are fellow CFOs and chief accounting officers doing, will be as big or perhaps even bigger. That's just my personal opinion, but just a lot of the time what HR is doing won't carry nearly as much weight with a finance organization. Understandably, they've got a lot of weight bearing down on them for managing the money in the organization, and so they consider in many cases their peers other people doing the exact same thing at another organization. But it does vary. Certainly in organizations, we've certainly had customers that have been incredibly successful in the HR side in the US. Netflix is a great example of this, and the finance organization said, we want a piece of that. We'd like to be able to do that as well. How can we take advantage of that too?
And how important is transparency and openness? Whether it's at the start of an implementation, the start of a digital transformation project, or just generally within businesses to try and use data to its full potential. How important is transparency and being open and anyone being able to get a real-time view of the data that they need?
I think it's really critical, and it's hard to do. And the biggest piece around it is when you've got multiple sources of that data, there's the challenge of integrating it all, but more importantly, securing it all. And having a single security model is really hard to do. And it's one of the things, I think many IT departments out there, that's a huge portion of their job, and they may not even realize it. When they're being asked to create a report and then create the same report, and then create the same report, they're actually being asked a security question. They want only these rows available to this audience, these rows to that audience, and those rows to that audience. And when you say it's all under a single security model or consolidate the security models as much as possible, it reduces that down dramatically. And it makes openness and transparency possible. And we're seeing this. Certainly GDPR is driving a lot of this sort of this concept, and I think that's the plus side of regulations like GDPR. They're saying you have to strive for excellence in security and in compliance and privacy. And you really do want to be able to open these systems up and say anybody who needs the data, who should have access to it, can. But if it's all over the place and it's in, say, spreadsheets, spread around on hard drives or even on paper in some organizations, that's near impossible to do. So I think openness is really critical, but it's based on another principle, which is really about a security model that is consistent.
That's an interesting perspective, and obviously you mentioned GDPR there, and that's a topic that I'm sure we're going to come back to in quite some depth in the rest of this discussion. But thank you for that high-level overview, and I'm going to pass back to René now just to get his thoughts before I open it up for a bit more of a discussion. So, René, we've heard about digital transformation. Obviously, Dave's mentioned that in his discussion as well. People that I'm talking to, in the industry, whether C-level executives or IT managers, are very focused on how they can successfully digitally transform their business, and the cloud is absolutely going to play a key role in that. But could you give our audience a high-level summary of why the cloud is so important from a digital transformation perspective when it comes to, financial and HR data?
Well, as I said before, we've seen the cloud developing from just a data center that someone else runs, where you just host something, to the increasing use of business applications in the cloud, and also sort of cloud native business applications that are really sort of spurring on business transformation, especially I think in the field of HR. And I think when it comes to the business applications, we've seen these applications offer a wide variety of different HR functions that are brought together in a single package. It covers talent management, admin functions, mobile access into one, and we're increasingly seeing financial data being brought into those applications. But it also, another thing about these applications is it frees professionals from being sort of trapped behind a desktop computer in an office in a certain certain location. Now we're seeing the ability to pretty much access any data you need to administer it from any device anywhere in the world, and also in a much more secure fashion. So I think, like I said, the real value here is the ease of use and the ease of setup and the security here.
You mentioned kind of the value, and I think when it comes to any technology, not leastly cloud, cost is a big focus, and certainly for financial professionals and finance departments, they're super laser focused on cost. How can IT decision makers, business decision makers, the stakeholders within the business cut past the kind of the cost of something to actually see the value of it? Because obviously cost and value are very different things. So how what advice or insight would you give there to kind of cutting through not spending money for money's sake, but cutting through the kind of the pound signs of what something's actually going to cost, and look to the value that it will give the organisation?
Well, again, when it comes to these applications, you can't really focus on the cost. You can't say it's going to cost per user per year. It's an important factor, but beyond that, what drives you to buy into a particular business application is the value it brings to you. Like I said earlier, the ability to access data from any device, anywhere. You basically you can do your job anywhere you like and not be tied down to a desk with a computer in an office. That's where the value comes in. And also with these apps, you're seeing increased functionality that we wouldn't have seen with on-premise software, and also increased security. Often SaaS providers provide much better security as well.
You mentioned security there, and obviously Dave mentioned security, in the context of transparency and openness, and different versions of reports are driven not for the sake of it, but because there's certain information that other people shouldn't see. What are the key security considerations, that people need to focus on in a cloud world versus on-premise? Obviously, because security is often up there in front of cost in terms of a reason not to move to the cloud. So what are the key factors that people are still worried about around the cloud implementation?
Well, I think it was obviously a concern in the early days of the cloud, because I think people didn't know what the cloud was or what it offered, or because they couldn't conceptualize it, they couldn't see the security around it. I mean, before you had your on-premise software and you had a security team, and their job was to secure that infrastructure. We're seeing nowadays, I don't think that's a particular problem, because for one, the large-scale SaaS providers have their own security teams. It's built from the ground up with security in mind. It's not being tacked on later on, which you find with other on-premise software. So basically they can secure at scale, and oftentimes they have much better security than what a company can do by themselves. So I think you can't let security be a reason not to use SaaS. I think security is now a reason to use SaaS.
Interesting. And so, based on what you've just said there, what's the best way if I'm an IT manager, a CTO, a CIO? Obviously, it's not my decision alone. I will make recommendations on what technology, cloud or otherwise, to use. But how would I what's your recommendations as to how to get other stakeholders, including end users, on board? Because it's one thing to implement something; it's another thing entirely to get people to actually use it to get that value.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a list as long as your arm. The key to getting stakeholder buying, it can be hard and it can be a stumbling block. But there's a number of things you can do. You can first of all recognise your company's weaknesses. You can't change an organisation unless you understand its legacy systems and in any related sticking points. You've got to work out what your stakeholder motivations are. If you can understand their mindset, then it's easier to sell what you're trying to do to them. You've got to simplify the sell. You've got to bring the project to life. You've got to show them how things work and have demonstrations. And if you've got something tangible, then stakeholders can see and conceptualize a bit more. Another thing is you've got to include everyone from the start. You can't leave people out. You got to get them. You got to include them from the process of change from the start. But also, once you include them, you've got to keep the communication going. Communication is absolutely essential. If people feel left out, then they don't feel part of the project. You've got to also develop the business case. You've got to have answers to the hard questions about what will the investment cost, but also what the returns are, what the value you're bringing to, and you've got to dispel the fears. You've got to you need to get people to understand how they fit into the digital transformation strategy. They need to know how the technology is going to help them work more efficiently and smarter, and they need to know that this is the right thing to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Rene. So I'm going to bring it back to more of a group discussion again there, and just pick up some of the key points that you mentioned there, Rene, and bring Dave on board to get his perspective. You talked about communication being absolutely vital and involving everybody. Obviously, Dave, your job title is CTO, so obviously you're primarily largely focused on the technical side of things. Yeah. But obviously you do have to converse with other stakeholders within the business, within Workday. but also, when you're talking to customers, you have to be able to speak the language of the CIO, the IT manager. So, do you agree with Renee in terms of the importance of that communication, but not just, one-off communication and ongoing dialogue?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. Renee is right on when it comes to that. I think it's one of the challenges that we face. At Workday, we use Workday. It's not, hopefully shouldn't come as some massive surprise that we use it for HR, payroll, and finance. And we really do see with those applications that our end user is every employee at the organization. So there's over 8,000 employees, and every one of them is a customer of all of those applications. And so communication is critical. I think it's one of the challenges, to be quite blunt, that we face in terms of enterprise software. Often we're selling to a small select group of administrators in finance, in HR, and it's sometimes a question of whether they're doing a good job of representing who we see as the end consumer that we'll have of our service in the future. So it is, and that communication is critical. We can't have, for Rolls-Royce or other customers like that, we couldn't have in the presentations and in the demonstrations that we did years ago for them taking a look at our software, every employee of the company, but we had to have really good representatives of that. And I think that's part of that transformation, is recognizing that in finance, in HR, that a big portion of your job is facilitating that communication. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that IT is involved, because IT can't be myopic, or never has been able to be. They can't be just beholden to their own department. They've never been able to get away with that. And so often they can have that bigger organizational view and an understanding of how that communication needs to happen. Even though they're often seen as, hey, they're the technical people, they've been the ones that have had to facilitate that communication internally, and certainly part of the role for us on the technology side too.
And I think, times have changed, and you mentioned there that, the IT department has never really been able to kind of ignore the rest of the business. Although in an on-premise world, they have historically, in certain instances, had a reputation for being able to circumnavigate, the need to do that. But obviously the cloud changes that. Things are much more open, things are much more transparent. Me as an end user, me as a line of business department head, me as a CIO, whatever my job title, I'm able to access, I can see what you're doing from a technology standpoint. So I'm probably going to ask questions and raise, concerns about stuff that previously in the on-premise world I wouldn't have been privy to. So is that both a blessing and a curse in terms of?
It is, and I think IT departments are feeling it all over the world. It used to be in the past. I mean, something that IT knows well is adoption, application adoption, right? They know that end users can choose to not adopt an application. So you can go live on time, on budget with your project, and then nobody uses it. That used to be because they would write things down instead of using your application, or they'd send emails because of your application. Now it's because they can go to the iTunes store and download something that will better meet their needs. And so there's a really strong awareness that they have to be really good at that. They have to be really have a deep understanding of how to facilitate that. And that wasn't as true in the past, and it's coming at them really quickly. It is a challenge I think for a lot of organizations. How do you deal with people putting down a credit card to buy what is now your standard enterprise application because you weren't paying enough attention to making sure that those end users' needs were met? And
is that happening, from an HR or finance perspective? Are people finding ways to kind of implement shadow IT in those areas, or is it more of a general, across the business? If you don't get it right as an IT decision maker, Mr. End User over here is going to go and find an app that works better for them, or a better way of helping them do their job.
I think it is surprisingly in enterprise as well. It's pieces and parts. It might be an expense application, or I want to be able to view my org structure, so I buy an org charting application, and that's what we start to use as the standard. So it's not the core application necessarily, because you can't avoid that, but it's other pieces of it. And I think that that's something that we certainly recognize. We want to be. We measure ourselves against those type of consumer applications and say our usability should be as good or better than those, and in addition should have access to the core data. But it's part of the reason we exist. When we first started, when we looked at all the different applications out there in HR and in finance, the sort of peripheral applications, things like expenses from a new cloud company and talent from a new cloud company, when we first started, we were actually told by venture capitalists and our investors, you should be building out that peripheral piece of application. And our argument was, no, we shouldn't. We should be fixing the core. The reason why those applications exist at all is because the core applications are not fulfilling the needs of the end users. Let's build that right first. And of course, we'll deliver that peripheral type, what it was in that time, peripheral application functionality as part of that. And I think that's really been proven over time. But the usability needs to be there, or else people, they'll avoid it. And I think it really does go for all different types of applications.
And that comes back to what you said, Rene, about involving everybody, because, you know, no one implements any type of software so that it can just be ignored. You know, there's people, you know, IT decision makers, business decision makers want people, their employees, to be more productive, to be able to, you know, benefit from technology. So, you know, from a usability standpoint, you know, is it about just getting stakeholders involved at the very beginning of the project, or should companies be getting feedback proactively from users about, you know, their experience of cloud-based technology?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think you know, to cover a few points, we've always been trying to, you know, always talked about this for years in technology, about, you know, breaking out of particular silos or finding alternative software that works. And now, and I think to myself, you know, there's a few things else to think about. If you go, oh, this software doesn't work, I'm going to go and use this software, you've immediately created a new silo, because if it works for you but no one else, then it doesn't gain traction across the organisation. So I think there's a, you know, you do need to get everyone together to find out, you know, what's going to work for everyone, and what's going to sort of prevent, you know, we're going to get rid of these silos only to create another silo later on, because, you know, it didn't.
It just moves the problem, right?
It just moves the problem. You know, you just recreate the problem that you had before, but now it's in the cloud instead of on premise. So I think that the thing here is for the people that are putting this applications into the company, is to think, you know, can I have something that works for everyone and doesn't recreate the silos?
Yeah. Obviously, digital transformation is a big topic in and of itself. You know, and HR and finance are generally considered the beating heart of any organisation. Yes. So, is it just finance and HR that are kind of critical to successful digital transformation, or are there other departments that need to feed into that to help an organisation actually be successful with true cloud and digital transformation?
Well, I think sometimes HR and finance are peripheral to it, but they need to, often they're the place many of our customers start, because it's a lower risk approach in many ways, because there's a model of so many other customers doing this and taking this approach. The other benefit, and this goes back to what Rene was saying as well, is there isn't much choice about this being your core enterprise data. There isn't a way to just say, well, we'll use a little app for our entire organizational structure, or how all our money is accounted for. That isn't possible for most reasonably sized businesses. So it's a great place where you can start on the cloud and then build from that. The longer term digital transformation for most organizations is something other than that. If you want to become the next digital organization, having HR and finance in place and having all that data accessible and secured and in the cloud, and really a good model of how to do cloud well, that's a starting point. But really, you're going to get the value out of other things. Companies that are better at HR and finance than any other company in the world are not necessarily the top companies in the world. They use that as a foundation to be able to do all the other systems and people things and money things that they need to do to be the best in the organization. So, you know, I'm biased in terms of I think it's really important, but we really do feel that it's a starting place that a lot of organizations feel is, surprisingly, a safer area to start with before they really look at other applications that they might turn over as well.
And digital transformation, you know, is very much talked about as being a journey, and something, you know, digital evolution is something that people talk about as well. With that in mind, obviously there are many benefits to be gained by successfully transforming yourself into a digital organisation. But there must be, some pitfalls and some problems that people need to be aware of as well. So, do you guys have any particular ones that keep coming up when you're talking to customers or industry?
Well, I think when it comes to the pitfalls, they're generally the same wherever you go. You'll have people stalling. It's easier to stall than it is to work things through. Another pitfall is trying to change everything at once. Don't try and burn the ground. It doesn't work. But also with these projects, there can be a loss of urgency. These can sort of run out of energy at a certain point. So it's important to try and keep the momentum going. Another pitfall is introducing technology just for the sake of it, because you go, oh, that looks nice and shiny, but it doesn't get used. And also, a common thing is, resistance to change. People don't like changing if they can avoid it. But you've got to show why the change is necessary. You've got to show the benefits.
Got to get the buy-in, and I think you've raised a really interesting point there. Obviously, we're primarily having a technology discussion here. Obviously, technology is in your job title, Dave, but you must have to be mindful as a CTO of the other elements that you need to be mindful of. The resistance to change that people naturally have, even if they're not willing to admit it, and also the cultural elements. So, how big a factor are those things, as well as choosing the technology and the partner that people are going to work with?
Well, I think they're huge and they come first. I've realized in my years in business now that there's only one type of change that people like, and that's when you, Maggie, or you, Renee, change to make me happier. That's the only, me change? Well, that's a bit of a problem, okay. And even for folks in IT or in digital transformation, they'll talk a big game about, but it's really about everybody else changing. And that is a challenge. It is hard, and there's good reason why people don't change. It's because in many cases, what they're doing is working really well, and it's worth considering that as part of the change process. That's why I was talking about, there's always a trade-off. There's something you're going to lose, and if you're going to lose, a key part of your business, and that's a chunk of your market share, it is worth really paying attention to that as a component of how you're going to go about changing. We certainly see that in the software business. It's one of the reasons why a lot of the legacy vendors, and I didn't mention it, but I used to be with PeopleSoft a very long time ago. It's the reason why things didn't change there for a long time is because there was so much revenue being generated off of these existing applications that it would have been suicide to just force everybody to jump forward. And so it's worth paying attention to that experience and that knowledge that is driving people to be reluctant to change is you have to pay attention to. So it isn't just about coaxing them to move forward. It's also saying, what's the trade-offs here? What are the real trade-offs? Knowing that they're going to have a bias towards they'd rather not change. I think it's a critical component. We talked about, we've used the word transformation multiple times. People are at the core of that, and the technology, again, can create a barrier to them being able to change or see that a change is possible. But even once you remove that, it doesn't mean that people are going to just flock forward and say we're ready for a change now.
I was going to say, picking up on what you just said, a lot of people will think that they're doing their job really, really well. But sometimes they can't see wood for the trees, and everyone else is saying, actually, it's not as good. It's not as good. And we can see how you can do it better. So I think sometimes, people get into their minds that they're doing a good job when really it's not. It's suboptimal.
Or it could be that it's not that they're doing a bad job. They've just potentially got bad processes or bad technology. So is it about making becomes less of a technology conversation and more of a relevancy and a kind of benefit conversation? So you make it, and you have to change that conversation depending on who you're talking to, right? But understanding how this can help them. So you start with what they're trying to achieve, and then you very much work your way back, and then it becomes, a very short technology conversation.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it also becomes a systems conversation, and I don't mean technical systems. I mean the system, the approach that an organization, the processes that an organization uses. And that's why it doesn't come down to individuals. You may be brilliant at your job, but you're part of a system that is fundamentally broken, and speeding up your part of that process is just speeding up a broken process.
Yeah.
It's not helping anyone. And that's why it does take that type of leadership, whether it's from the CIO, the chief transformation officer, chief digital, chief executive, the head of HR, the head of finance, to be able to have that view of here's the process, here's the systems that are holding us back. And we need to adjust those, we need to change those, and people need to change. And maybe technology needs to change. But first, we need to look at that bigger picture of how do we think about this business and how does that need to shift. Some organizations are great at that. Some are prepared for it. I'll go back to Netflix as an example. I'm very familiar with them. And when they first started, they delivered CDs or DVDs to people's houses. But from the very start, their CEO did not envision that was their business. It was a recommendation engine. It was a way of delivering entertainment. And because it was easy enough for him to see at that point that the future was streaming, just not yet, right, when they first started. And so they were ready to be able to transform. That's a tough thing to be able to foresee with as quickly as businesses are moving today. And for many businesses, if you don't have the benefit of being just like 13 years old like Workday, you're a couple hundred years old, it makes it very difficult to foresee what that next change is going to be. And often the systems are the processes are what are constraining being able to be agile.
You mentioned Netflix there, and obviously
Yeah.
Netflix, is very often and rightly so held up as a great example of a company that is very much focused on cloud first now.
Yes.
And I hear a lot about cloud first and mobile first, but what does it really mean?
Yeah, so for us, cloud only is what we do. But for mobile first, it is for Workday, specifically developing on the mobile platform first. So when we look at any new piece of functionality, any new capability that we have requested by our customers or internally that comes up, we first say, how's that going to work on an iPhone or an Android device? And if the answer is not very well, we'll back up and say, well, what is it going to look like on a tablet or on an iPad? And if again the answer is, you know what, it's not going to work there because it's heads down data entry, it's keying of data, then we'll back up to how does it work on a browser with a keyboard. So we're always starting from that point, in many cases just solving it right there and then just backporting what it would do on a mobile to a browser. So, and we've been doing that for 4 or 5 years now, in a very dedicated fashion, and it really shows in terms of the application functionality that we build. That is really our focus. We know that the customers that buy Workday, that are using it, whether they initially are ready to go there or not, that the old traditional, what would be called self-service, really means today mobile, and they need to be able to do that. It's table stakes.
So I'm going to say, I think companies nowadays have to be both cloud first and mobile first, because the cloud first, it means concentrating what happens in the middle, how everything works, and the mobile first bit is basically how things appear or how things work on the endpoint. So you have to have both of those. You can't just go think about mobile first and not cloud first, or cloud first without mobile. You have to do both.
And you mentioned cloud only there, Dave. So it's not a nice to have. It's a must have. Having that focus.
It is for us, and I think for long term, there's some real benefits to that. Part of it is the constraints that it puts on our development staff and our R&D department. There isn't a fallback. There isn't for that piece of functionality, we're just going to need to do on-premise for that. We have to get creative. And when you look at things like security, when 10 years ago, when cloud for enterprise applications was fairly new, it might have been easier to say, well, if we just gave them a database on their premise, then they'd be happy and they'd be able to be secure. So we had to go to that extra degree to be able to say, what do we need to do to ensure that our customers' HR, finance, money and people data is entirely secure in the cloud? There isn't a fallback option. As Cortez would say, we're burning the boats, right? Like that idea of this is the only approach that we take. And you can see it for Workday in terms of how we developed. We've got a alphabet soup of certifications, ISO 27001, 27018, SOC 2 reports, and that's because we said, for us, the way to motivate ourselves internally is to make sure that that is the only option that we have. I think it's possible to do it without that, but it's certainly easier for us, given when we started, that cloud only is really the option.
Excellent. So before I open up to some audience questions, because I see we've got some in, which is absolutely fantastic. So please keep them coming, viewers. It's a big topic, but I think it would be remiss of us not to touch upon it. Certainly, as we're talking about, HR and finance in the cloud, GDPR. The deadline is looming. Yes. May the 25th. It's not very far away. How much of a concern is GDPR when it comes to internal HR and finance departments? Because a lot of the conversations that I've had are about how GDPR is driving change for business decision makers, IT decision makers, what they're going to need to do from a technical standpoint, from a data standpoint. But obviously, you mentioned earlier that HR is always been a people-driven business, and finance has been much more data-driven. So how is GDPR going to shake things up or cause more problems as we move forward?
Well, I think it involves both finance and HR because it's any data that you have inside the organization. Yeah. I mean, people data and money are really intertwined. It's been a big topic for us, for sure. If a company's not thinking about GDPR already, there's probably somebody in Brussels who's thinking about that company right now. So it's certainly been a big topic, but I think the big impact that we're going to see is once people become aware of their rights, especially as employees in the European Union, they're going to start to act upon them. And this is going to cause a lot of disruption. If an employee comes in on May 26th and says, I want you to tell me everything you have on me, and that's spread in Excel spreadsheets and paper files all over the place, it really will put a strain on every part of the organization. So I think that's going to be the much more immediate impact beyond the longer term fear of the fines, which are considerable and understandable why you should be concerned about that. But it's also just going to be that people know about it now, and for an HR or finance department, it's going to be, can I comply with that? How quickly can I comply? And how much disruption is it going to cause inside of my organization? And we're seeing already the effects of it. I think it's certainly easier for organizations that, like in the UK, that have been under the DPA rules for some time, in Germany, Austria, where they've had those sort of restrictions. For a lot of organizations, that's going to be the struggle that will happen after that time. And it will drive some of the technology decisions for good or bad.
But that's also where cloud really comes into its own. You mentioned it's about the data that you hold on an individual and their right to ask, what details you've got on them. If you don't know where, you've got that data, if you don't know where it's stored, and it could be stored in multiple places by multiple people, then you've got a big problem. But obviously cloud makes that a lot easier.
It can, there's lots of different ways to do the cloud. So one thing that I would say, if you're talking to vendors and you say, what's the GDPR strategy, or what the right question to ask is, what is your organization, what is in your software, what have you had to do to get ready for GDPR? And the answer you would hope for is not much. That tells you a lot about the architecture. I sometimes say that Workday started getting ready for GDPR in 2006 when we first started. It's impossible. Those regulations didn't exist, but we were designing in privacy and compliance from the start because of the rules that I mentioned for the UK, for Germany, for Austria, in the US, very different rules there. We were building global applications for enterprise right from the start, so we had to take those into account. And in some ways, for Workday, it's actually easier. GDPR makes things simpler because now there's a consistent set of rules for a very large geographical and diverse region. And that's what you would hope to hear is, yep, there's a few tweaks we have to make here and there, and that's certainly true for Workday. There's some things that were in the regulations that hadn't been anywhere else before, but that's what you would be looking for, is not much should be the answer to that question.
Great stuff, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to some of the audience questions now, because there's quite a few, so we'll try our best to get through them in the time that we've got left available. So this is an interesting one, and both of you have probably got a different perspective on this. So what role should IT play in migrating these line of business functions to the cloud? Is it purely a technical support role, with the migration being led by the business department?
So I'll let Renee start on that one.
Well, I think it can't be just IT-led or business-led. It has to be a combination of the two. Like I said earlier, when it comes to migrating line of business apps to the cloud, or any particular transformation, there has to be communication and involvement from stakeholders, interested parties right from the start. If if it gets led by one particular group like IT or business, it will go down a particular path, and they might find that you end up trying to do something impossible or that contradicts what the other people, other stakeholders want. So it has to be both.
And I absolutely agree. And I think one of the challenges we see often, the finance department or an HR department will say, oh, we're going to get this cloud application, we're going to be able to do that ourselves. And yeah, you'll be able to do a lot more than you might have been able to do in the past, where there was coding required to be able to build out the applications or servers that need to be set up. But there's a critical role for IT. And often it's something that is ignored because we're removing that coding and that server requirement. There are soft skills, what would be called soft skills, that IT have that don't exist elsewhere in the business. An understanding of what are the downstream effects, or in UK you call it knock-on effects, right, of making that change for just in the finance system. What are the integrations that need to happen? Does this affect compliance and governance? Are there other stakeholders in the organization that are going to be affected? IT tends to be more expert than they know at that, and things like user adoption. How do we drive user adoption? So it needs to be both, and I think it needs to be both in a certain way. A recognition that IT may be backing away from some of their responsibility around coding and servers and some of the technical aspects, but other skills are going to come to the fore. And the same on the business side, that there are skills that they had, filling out forms and papers and being experts in what steps happen next, that actually may disappear as well. And they need to step up in terms of their understanding of the larger picture and the vision and more strategic side. So it's both for sure, and it's certain aspects of both that they're going to need to let go of, and other ones that are going to need to step forward.
Excellent. And this is probably a related question. So finance is traditionally wary about storing data in the cloud. How can I persuade the CFO that doing so is actually a good idea and that it's really safe?
Yeah, so part of that is just there's got to be a big business driver for it, because it is different. It isn't comfortable and having it all locked up in your own server. So first there needs to be a driver to say, I'm willing to at least look at that as a question, because it's a perceived risk. If you're comfortable that your system's safe today, why would you ever compromise that unless the benefit or the transformation is so important? And then, the benefit we have now is that there's clearly great security in the cloud. There are many companies that are more than comfortable to house not only their HR, their finance, but also their customer data all in the cloud. Many of the companies that we do business on a regular basis are using third-party cloud solutions to be able to do that interaction. So the standards have become much greater. Things like the alphabet soup I mentioned, but even things like the Cloud Security Alliance and other bodies have stepped forward to say, here's the standards of how you are going to maintain that data, can make you much more comfortable. But I do think to get a CFO over that hump, you need to be able to make the business case that it's worth at least considering this sort of change. Because again, CFO is no different than any other human. They want change for everybody else, but not, taking that risk or that change on themselves is difficult. I think the maturation of the cloud, though, is really, and looking at other customers that have done it, is a big piece of it.
Excellent. So this is a question probably from more of a business standpoint rather than a technical standpoint. So I'm gonna put this one to you first and foremost, Renee. How can storing HR and finance data in the cloud add strategic value to my business?
I think again, what you've got to look at is how you, well, first of all, importantly, how the data is secured, because secured data is valuable data. Secondly, you've got to understand that the data can be only accessed by the people that need to access it, and they can access it from any particular endpoint. Again, going back to that cloud first, mobile first scenario. The data is the data is the most important thing in both those aspects. If you've got the cloud bit right, the applications right in the cloud, and you've got the endpoint right, as in people can access it, that's where your whole value proposition comes in.
Excellent. Do you have any perspective on that from a technical standpoint, how technology considerations, technology decisions, and the technology that you ultimately implement can actually add strategic value?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the choice. The openness of those systems, the ability for you to be agile over time. We really do consider that's a critical component. It's again another thing that we'll ask our customers to sort of join us on a journey on, which is I think in a lot of cases with legacy ERP, it was you go through this incredibly difficult slog of implementation, you get it done, and then you can now focus on other things. And then maybe every couple years you deal with an upgrade, and that's another slog. With true cloud applications, and certainly with Workday, it can be a continuous process. And so encouraging that continuous process, and then also having an organization inside, a center of excellence, if you will, that is able to adopt that new functionality, take advantage of it, and really be agile over time is a really key piece. And it's also another determinant of long-term success for organizations. So it's really a business question, right? The technology needs to support that. It's another one of those barriers. Once you remove that barrier, it doesn't mean people are ready to be agile. When you say you can make changes on the fly as you need to and be able to have confidence that they'll function, it doesn't mean that they will. They may still just say, well, I don't want to touch anything. It's all working just fine and I'm not ready to change.
And also, if you could decrease the amount of time that you implement and also upgrade, you realise the value of those applications much more faster, and I think that's where you unlock the strategic value.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask one final question before we get your key takeaways, because I'm conscious we're nearly out of time. What kind of insights can I expect to get from about my staff from storing HR and financial data in the cloud and then analysing it? So it's one thing to store; it's another thing to actually then make valuable use out of that data. So do you have a perspective on that, René? We've talked about analytics and the importance of getting insight from information previously.
I think it's important to get the insight into data. I mean, the whole point of using any apps is, especially with data, is that you have a lot of information that you can't possibly do manually. So if you can have some sort of automated analytics, you can get those business insights a lot quicker. It's not something that was easily done with on-premise, but we're just seeing with the cloud, we're gonna see more automation and more insights, and also with the advent of more use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, we're going to unlock ever more insights, which will can help move the business forward.
Excellent. So thank you very much for that. Before we run out of time, I really want to give the audience a kind of a high-level summary of your key takeaways, really. So if I may start with you, René, in a minute or less, what are your 3 key takeaways that you think the audience should bear in mind going forward?
Okay, well, first of all, you've got to, as I said, involve stakeholders from the start. There's no point in putting applications out there that employees won't use. It's a waste of time and money. Secondly, focus on the value of those cloud applications rather than the cost, because the value, if the value is much more than the cost, then you've gained from the start. And third, rather than just porting legacy apps over to a cloud, use cloud native apps that will work much more effectively, and also have the extra functionality that you may not have been able to use before, because and stuff that you've probably had to sort of put on top of using Excel, like spreadsheets or whatever. Just try and focus on cloud native apps rather than just rely on legacy stuff ported to the cloud.
Great, thank you. And if I can ask the same of you, Dave, what would your 3 key takeaways be?
Well, so the first one is we're all becoming data-driven. Every organization is a data-driven organization, and making sure that you have as consistent and secured data as possible is going to determine all of those future technologies. And we hit on just briefly machine learning and bots and AI. All of those things are going to be dependent on data, even more so. So making sure that your data is consistent, especially starting with your core data of your money and your people in your organization, is going to be a critical component. And to go along with that, that requires transformation. And to me, that is really a marker of an organization that's ready to be able to get the most out of cloud applications, is one that first says, we're trying to transform our business and our technology is holding us back. That's the determinant. And not every company is there yet. Or maybe they will never get there. Maybe they don't need to transform. That's entirely possible. There are businesses that just don't need to, but many are in a position where they want to transform. If that's the driver, then you can start to look critically at, well, what do we need to change to be able to transform? And then the final piece is going back to that sort of idea of the mobile first and an end user. I really feel that the democratization of the applications in the enterprise space, driven by expectations in the consumer internet, and that drives the democratization of the data as well. That would be that third component of, we want to make sure that the audience that we're looking for our enterprise applications, whether they're finance, HR, or other parts of the enterprise, that those are really, that's really the biggest driver, is making sure that end users have the data they need to be able to make the decisions that drive the business.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I'm afraid, gentlemen, we're out of time, but it's been a fantastic discussion and certainly a topic we could probably spend a lot more time to talk about. So I want to thank you, Dave and Renee, once again for joining me. And thank you, audience, for joining us as well. And just a reminder that this webinar will be available on demand as well.